The Marine, still just a boy barely over 18 years old, screamed in pain as he struggled against the restraints that kept him lashed to a bamboo rack. 2 hours into the torture session, much of his body was covered in blood. But none of the wounds were fatal. Each cut into his flesh was meant to cause maximum pain, but keep him alive for the hours-long ordeal still to come. 3/4 of a mile away, the Marines on Hill 55 could do nothing but keep watch on the perimeter, trying to drown out the sound of the boy's screams. The Viet Cong had laid out a field of booby traps, mines, and hidden snipers between them and the site of the torture, chosen specifically for its great acoustics, allowing the Marines' screams to echo all around the fire base. There was nothing anyone could do but hope that the boy's torment would end soon. It wouldn't. A short, pretty Vietnamese woman in her mid-30s stood over the tortured Marine, grinning wickedly. She was the most lethal sniper the Viet Cong had, and also just so happened to be a self-taught expert in the art of torture. Over the last 24 months, the American Marines had provided many unwilling subjects, typically wounded men accidentally left behind, like the one lashed to the bamboo rack now. His patrol had been caught in an ambush, a bullet punching into his steel helmet and ricocheting off his skull, knocking him unconscious. Presumed dead, he'd been abandoned as the rest of the patrol ran for its life. "Scream louder, Marine. I want your friends to hear it," she snarled. Using a small stick, she worked on the fingers one by one, bending them backwards until the joint cracked audibly. Each break elicited a new scream. Back on Hill 55, Carlos Hathcock scanned the tree line with his scope, hoping to catch a glimpse of the torturer and her victim. He knew going out there would be a suicide mission, but he couldn't just sit here and do nothing. The VC sniper they'd taken to calling the Apache had been at this grim task before, targeting both American and Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops. Captain Edward James Land put a heavy hand on Hathcock's shoulder. "Ease up. There's nothing you can do. Get some rest, and in the morning, we start the hunt." Hathcock burned with fury, but he knew Land was right. The next day, Hathcock peered through the powerful spotting scope, surveying the village below. He and 2 other Marines were posted up above the village just 2 miles from Hill 55. There were suspicions of VC collaborators, but no definitive proof yet. Every time the Marines swept the village, all evidence vanished into thin air. And yet, Division Intelligence was confident that there was a bad apple or two, smuggling weapons and setting up booby traps for American patrols. The village was relatively quiet, the only movement being 3 men moving slowly down the center road in the direction of the fields. Hathcock scanned them with his scope, confirming that they were carrying farming tools and not rifles. No strange bulges under their black clothing. Hathcock relaxed. They still had 12 hours of daylight to sit and observe. Hathcock hoping against hope the Apache might slip up and make herself known. It had been his second student who spotted the man in the khaki shirt and black shorts before he did. He'd been acting suspiciously for the last hour, ducking into one of the far huts and then looking around. Twice now he walked down the main road that bisected the village and then looked up and down in both directions before retreating to the hut. Hathcock tracked him from behind the rifle scope, the student on the spotting scope. The man looked around and then stepped into his hut. "That hot dog is up to something," muttered the student. "Affirm," grunted Hathcock. Neither Marine took their eye off the hut. 10 minutes later, the villager reemerged, this time with a white canvas bag over his shoulder. Looking around once more, the man reached into the doorway of his hut and pulled out a Soviet-made SKS rifle. Hathcock gently applied pressure to the trigger, timing his trigger pull with his natural rest between breaths. From 800 yards away, his bullet struck 2 inches right off center mass on the upper chest, turning the heart into pulp. Hathcock's first thought had been that perhaps the villager was a local hunter, a dangerous occupation in the middle of a war front. But the 6-power scope sitting on top of that rifle convinced him otherwise. The light would fade soon, and when there was no further reaction from the village, the men packed up their gear to return to base. To get back, they'd have to swing along the backside of the village, ironically close to the dead man's hut. Half an hour later, as they neared the hut, Hathcock called a stop. Looking around, he dashed out of the cover and to the front of the hut, recovering the old SKS rifle. Just then, a villager came out of their hut. Hathcock and the villager simply stared at each other for a moment. Then Hathcock nodded, the villager looking at the body and nodding back. Hathcock turned and hustled back, but a white feather laying on the ground caught his eye. He didn't know why, but he was compelled to pick it up. As he placed it in his hat, he caught sight of the villager one last time. Then Hathcock slipped into the darkness. The entry wound was almost center mass on the corpse's chest. This told the Apache who was responsible. It could only be that American Marine instructor, the one that had already given her crews a bit of trouble since arriving just over a month ago. The Marine snipers were slowly eliminating her carefully built network of gunrunners, informants, and scouts. She'd already sent a dispatch to the North Vietnamese Army command post just over the border in the mountains. At first, she thought that perhaps the American B-52 bomber raids had finally succeeded in destroying the command post buried 50 meters into the mountain. But word had finally arrived via courier. Her top priority was to kill the American snipers. And she'd start with this one. The one the villagers had started calling White Feather for the feather stuck in his cap. The thought irritated her. A sniper does everything possible not to draw attention to themselves, but this was provocation. Her plan was simple: grab more Marines and torture them, lure him out into the open, kill him, or preferably take him alive. She relished the thought of putting one of America's heroes under her knife. "She's got another one," growled Captain Land as he burst into the sniper hooch, nearly tearing the flimsy wooden door off its hinges. He dropped on the nearest unoccupied seat with a loud huff, the chair creaking under the weight of the large man in all of his combat equipment. "Apache?" asked Hathcock. Land nodded. "Post about 5 miles east. They're missing one after patrol. She strung him up at night and kept the entire outfit awake until dawn, with the poor kid screaming." Hathcock felt something new inside him. He never felt any particular hatred for the targets he'd shot. Each and every one was just doing their duty, and he was doing his. But this woman was different. She had no honor, no morality. She'd strung up and tortured her fellow countrymen as often as Americans. He didn't know what dark hatred drove her, but he knew one thing: she had to be stopped, and he was the one to do it. Sunrise bathed the clearing and the hill beyond it in golden light. If it wasn't for the fact that said hill was now mostly charred black and covered in broken tree trunks, it would have been a beautiful sight. Months ago, intelligence had pinpointed it as the base of operations for the Apache's local troop of guerrilla Viet Cong, and the Air Force had dropped enough munitions and napalm on it to make Hathcock think of Ground Zero in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. She'd obviously survived the attack, much to the Marines' chagrin. 50 yards in front of the blind he shared with Captain Land, there was a broad field, mostly clear, save for a few tall grasses. The Marines often used it as a landing zone for helicopter insertions, and that attracted VC attention, who sought to mine it when not in use. Hathcock had thought it'd be good hunting ground, and Land had agreed, accompanying him as a spotter. Past the field were low bushes and shrubs, stretching to a small stream that ran along the perimeter of the destroyed hill. There was still enough cover up there for a sniper, though, and the Marines' eyes were trained smartly upon it and the trail through the grass that led to the jungle. Laying under the baking sun, Hathcock and Land waited. Sweat was starting to make their green and dark brown camo paint run on their faces and hands, and yet the pair did not dare move, even as a colony of vicious ants crawled over them, delivering several painful bites. Suddenly, there was movement at the far edge of the clearing, close to where the thin trail through the grass began. Both men zeroed in on it. Hathcock threw the rifle scope and Land threw the spotter. The tall Vietnamese man moved behind a thick trunk, a long gun on his shoulder. The man was professional enough to not step out into the open, but instead looked and listened, sniffing the air for cigarette smoke, a dead giveaway that Americans were around. This VC could only belong to one unit, and that meant the Apache could be near. Hathcock felt his pulse quicken as he adjusted himself behind the rifle, hoping that the feared sniper would show herself. "Let me have the gun. You've been at it all morning," whispered Land. Hathcock wanted more time. He knew the VC soldier would eventually reveal himself. Land grunted disapprovingly but stayed glued to his spotting scope. 15 minutes later, Land broke the silence with a terse whisper again. "Well, you don't need the relief, I do. I'm tired of looking through this damn spotting scope." "Yes, sir, sorry." Hathcock pulled his eye clear of the scope and offered it to Land. Land reached for the rifle, but then both men instantly froze. 200 yards away, a figure stepped out of the tree line and into the clearing, a long gun clearly visible on his shoulder. Both men tugged at the weapon like children fighting over a toy. "Give me the weapon!" Land's whisper was low but threatening. A commotion of the two Marines fighting over the rifle caused their cover to shake around them. Out in the field, the VC sniper suddenly turned in their direction and quickly ran away. Land let go of the rifle. "We missed him and got made. Let's pack it up. Day's done." Hathcock thought for a moment. "What if we don't turn in, sir?" Land shot him a skeptical look. Let him go back to his commander. Let him tell her about the two Marines fighting like children in the bush. She'll be eager for an easy capture. Land chuckled. "All right, but we can't stay here." Hathcock nodded across to a new vantage point. It would put them directly in front of the shattered hill the enemy VC had run, dangerously close to the enemy. But it was also the last place the enemy would be looking for them. Silently, the two Marines picked up their gear and picked their way there through the jungle cover. There was no guarantee the Apache would show up, but Hathcock was confident that once she got word of two idiot Marines fighting in the bush, she'd take the bait. The afternoon grew long. The bugs were truly swarming now. Cursing them under his breath, Land whispered to Hathcock, 1,600 were pulling up stakes. Hathcock nodded slightly in agreement. Half an hour later, both the men spotted movement at the top of the hill. Moving the rifle scope into position, Hathcock could clearly make out the source, a lone VC crawling on his hands and knees. "Don't shoot," whispered Land. "Look at his weapon. That's an AK, not a long gun. Bet you dollars to donuts he's a scout." The duo watched the VC crawl from down the hill and along the perimeter that ran close to the stream. Finally, he reversed his journey, crawling back up the hill and disappeared over the crest. Afterwards, though, there was no more activity. The sun was starting to cast long shadows. Hathcock knew it was well past the 1,600 deadline. By his guess, closer to 1,800. "Losing our light, Carlos. Time to pull up stakes," said an irritated Land. "Just a little more, sir. I've got a feeling they're coming." Land was about to issue a proper order when they glimpsed movement at the top of the hill. Multiple figures moving carefully but confidently through the shattered trees. Land immediately whipped his spotting scope up to them. "VC for sure. 6, 8 of them. Is she there?" Land peered through the spotting scope. "Can't tell. Light's low. Hold on. That one, the one that just broke off, squatting in the bush. It's her." This was it. The moment Hathcock had been waiting for. "You sure?" he asked. There was no doubt. Land grimaced. "Too much cover. Hand me the radio handset. We're gonna blast them. Be ready to pick up stragglers." Hathcock confirmed the order, moving his scope across the unit and finding the woman. She was behind too much cover for a clean shot, and besides, the captain was right. Artillery would get them all, or most. He'd clean up the rest. The first shell arrived in seconds. It exploded at the top of the hill, where the trail the VC unit had been using met with a proper road. 3 Viet Cong were immediately blasted to pieces. 2 more shells arrived on the heels of the first, their explosions ripping through the trees. The Apache had been squatting as the shells landed, the concussive force knocking her forward and flat on her face. She struggled to get up as more shells rained down on the hilltop. Working their way down as instructed by Captain Land, the artillerymen were getting their own revenge. The Apache finally managed to stand up, her rifle as an afterthought, as she began running in a blind panic. Tears and sweat stung her eyes and shrapnel ripped through the foliage around her. In her terror, she didn't even realize she was running downhill, straight toward where her scout had spotted the American snipers. That same scout now screaming out a warning, trying frantically to be heard above the concussive blast of incoming shells. But the Apache could hear nothing but the blood beating in her ears. Her system spiked with adrenaline and pure terror, a primal combination. Hathcock lined his sights up. The terrain was uneven, making her bounce around as she ran at a full sprint. She was moving directly down his gun barrel, however, and their new position was a full 100 yards closer than the last, making the shot easier. He breathed in and out, settling into his body's natural rhythm, shutting out the cacophony of artillery blasts directly in front of him. When his breathing reached its natural pause, he squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, the heavy bullet closing the distance between him and the Apache in a fraction of a second. It smashed through her collarbone and shattered her spine, causing her to drop instantly. Her momentum carried her limp body forward, though, causing her to cartwheel before coming to a rest on her back. She was angled head down toward Hathcock, and his next round punched through her shoulder and into her chest cavity. The kinetic force it delivered ripped through her organs, finally settling somewhere just below her stomach. The Apache's chest shuddered and went still. Hathcock calmly adjusted his sight picture. The man who'd been chasing her had immediately turned around and sprinted back up the hill upon seeing her fall. Hathcock's round caught him directly between the shoulder blades, pitching him forward into the burned-out foliage. Hathcock and Land scanned for more targets. When the artillery was finally done doing its job, though, there were no survivors left. Finally, both men relaxed. "You got her," grinned Land, eyeing the Apache's limp body through his scope. Hathcock nodded solemnly as he shouldered his rifle. "Aye, aye, sir." Now go check out True Story of 1 Marine versus 150 enemy soldiers, most hardcore sniper, or check out this other video instead.